Okay, welcome back. So let's see how this goes. If it turns out that this is not a big thing, then we'll go ahead and do a Xena retrospective. Um, okay, so it's come up several times, and Helen had a patch up that removed something, which I forget now what it was. But every so often people say the support matrix either has stuff in it that it shouldn't, or is missing something that would be really helpful to have in there. So what I'd like to do is just, and we always say, okay, somebody will do something about it. So what we can do now is just go look at what we've got and see if it makes sense. So just to remind you, the idea, so the support matrix predates me and my involvement in Cinder, but my understanding is that it's supposed to assist operators in looking at a back end to see what kind of extra features they might get by selecting a particular back end. Or conversely, if they have a back end in mind, they can take a look and see if there's anything that they might miss and then, make a decision. But the idea is it's supposed to help out operators, I think.
Well, so I can provide a
Oh,
little more
thank
history
you. Okay.
since this goes back to even my early days in Cinder. And geez, I don't think, well, maybe other than Eric, nobody else has been here this long. Um, so originally it was the argument over what are the minimum requirements for a driver, and getting that documented. So that went on for quite a while. And then, there used to be a lot of churn and adding in new features and vendors wanting to get their features added in, all that sort of stuff. And it started to get confusing as to who supported what and why. And so we originally started with the list of here's what you must implement. And then as we started adding more and more features that could be implemented by different vendors, we needed a way to keep track of what those features were. And so we used to have this super ugly wiki page that was always out of date and not good. So I think about 3 years ago, we moved to this approach, which is at least a little better. I mean, the page that comes out of it isn't super pretty, but it's at least parsable. And this was, there used to be a lot of contention as to what Cinder should or shouldn't do and what was required. Obviously, that drama has reduced. But I think, so this was the original list of things with some minor changes that have happened since, that were the vendors and participants at the time felt were important. So, but I don't think there's any reason to, not review this and see if it all still makes sense.
Okay.
So if I
Is it
remember correctly, the matrix should have at the top, yeah, it's got the required driver functions there. So this only lists the things that are optional.
okay? All right. So what I've got is so there's a link to the documentation where you can see the generated page and what that looks like. So that's line 164 in the Etherpad. And then I grabbed the texts of the unrequired stuff and put that into a Etherpad for us to work on. So I didn't include the required features on the Etherpad, so you may want to take a look. I'm looking at my screen, so of course you can't see it. Okay, so I guess one quick question is just, does it still make sense to have this page? And I think since there are features that not every driver implements, we probably need to make distinctions. So, okay. All right. So I guess the first question is, with respect to the required driver functions, can anyone think of anything that has become so widely adopted that we could make it required? Or do we have a pretty good breakdown between required and non-required?
I don't think there's anything that's calling out to be moved into the
Sorry, my dog's playing with a bone around here and it's kind of noisy. Okay.
I think one of the things that was recently added was in volume migration, mentioning that it's a storage assisted. And I see another option called revert to snapshot that could be the same. We have a default mechanism that basically deletes the volume, creates it again, and things like that.
Mhm.
So I think we should also mention there that the storage assisted.
Okay.
because we really want to state that it's like a performance optimization and not that it's missing.
Thank you. Yes.
I have a trivial visual suggestion, which we should transpose this table so the long list of vendors is on the left in a column, and the shorter list of features actually across the top as, header. I think it would digest easier.
Yeah, we had talked about that at one point. It just depends on having somebody who's interested in figuring out the Sphinx way to generate this. It should be possible though. So I don't know how interested you are in this kind of thing, Chuck.
I did go insert our, the Kioxia in there.
Mhm.
I don't know what Sphinx is, but I could probably come back with a solution if someone point me to the right reference.
All right.
Yeah,
I'll follow up on.
I know we've talked about doing that before, and if there's a easy way to do it, I don't disagree with that. I think it would be easier.
Put a to-do item in the Etherpad.
So Brian, I see in the first section, operation.supported, we have mentioned that the driver is marked unsupported and is removed if the problem isn't resolved at the end of the subsequent release. So we don't do that anymore, right?
Well,
Yeah, that's true. We allow unsupported drivers to stick around longer. So we should at least revise that. I think there may be some language on the all about drivers page that we can steal for this. Yeah, and speaking of that, actually, just a notice for people who are running third-party CIs, please take a look at them to see that they are responding, because, and also, I guess everybody's aware of the Cinder Stats. Let me give you that link so you can look, because this is where I go to see if what's going on. This service might be down at the moment. All right. Let me put this in the regular Etherpad. Okay. This is a script that Sean runs that generates. Well, I'm not. He gets it. Sean gets the information about what the CI is named from the driver. There's some required variables in each driver, and then he gets the CI name and then makes the query against Garrett. I'm wondering whether the Garrett update has just broken his script.
I talked to him a while back, and he had noted that some of the changes to Garrett that had been happening were breaking his stuff. So we should probably follow up with him if that's something he's able to continue maintaining or not.
Yeah. I guess I looked at it like maybe a week or so ago, and it was still sort of working. Okay, let me follow up because we'll have to make some kind of replacement plan. Okay. Okay, and then actually, you know what would probably be helpful is if you've got updates or points you want to make about the current text, put it in the support matrix review Etherpad directly in there instead of the main one, because then it'll be easier to follow things. Actually, instead of need some language here, let's just rewrite the sentence.
So what is our current policy? I've forgotten that we changed it.
So the current policy is that, well, let me find the statement of it instead of trying to say memory. I'll put this in the PTG Etherpad. Okay, so the current policy is the drivers eligible for removal may remain in the code repository as long as they continue to pass OpenStack CI testing. And when such a driver blocks the CI checker gate, it will be removed immediately. Thus, unsupported drivers may remain in the code repository for multiple releases following their declaration as unsupported. Operators
right.
should therefore take into account the length of time a driver has been marked unsupported when deciding to deploy an unsupported driver. The intent of this policy revision is twofold. It gives vendors a longer grace period in which to make the necessary changes to have their drivers reinstated as supported. And second, keeping these drivers in tree longer should make life easier for operators who have deployed storage backends with drivers that have been marked as unsupported. And actually we haven't, so that's been our policy since January 2020. It might be worth thinking about how we think about that now. Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, I guess kicking people out definitely gets people's attention, but it does cause some churn from release to release. So I don't know. So I guess I haven't seen that this is causing a problem necessarily, but I'm just one guy, so it would be good to hear if anybody else has a contrary opinion.
So, question, how is front-end QoS a required function?
Well, it's not. The thing is, for example, volume migration, host assisted, is a required driver function, and it's not something the driver has to do.
Okay.
So I feel like we either divide required driver functions with functions provided by the core Cinder code, we split it, or we include both,
Okay.
Yeah, maybe we could
Probably
change.
it's better to split it so that somebody as a driver developer can look at this and know what are the required functionality they have to actually implement.
So I wonder if for some of those that are implicitly supplied by Cinder, if we want to put them in a list of things that we expect to work that aren't necessarily provided by the driver itself. But would be useful for driver developers to know, well, yeah, I might want to test this and make sure it actually works.
So for the driver developers, we're going to be looking at the volume driver API. So I'm wondering whether that might be a better place to note this is the stuff you must implement. And then on this page, we could just say basic driver functions. So just all Cinder drivers, I was going to say, are tested to support the following functionality, but I don't even know if that's true.
Should be tested.
Right. So I think it makes sense to include some of these features that we offer on the front end. So if somebody's looking to see, okay, what does Cinder do? They've got a list.
One question, when do we have create image from volume, but not volume from image?
Huh. That's a good question.
Because in both cases, it's done by the core code.
Is it because image from him has some driver code with it? I don't know.
But the other one is also possible, if I remember correctly. For example, for RBD, you can have, if you are creating from an image, create volume from an image, you can have an optimized path in RBD because it checks the backend, and if glance exposes the backend location, and then it does a clone. So we probably need to add that one. Here and later on in the list of features that apparently I moved incorrectly, wrong place. Okay, it would be option 11 or whatever. Brian, I have added at the end of the document, line 111, a new section for the create volume from image, storage assisted.
Yeah. I think how many can do that. Because, all right, we'll have to just think about how we'll describe that. Because we also have the issue that if you're using Cinder as a glance store, then you can do a bunch of stuff that otherwise you have some optimized paths regard that they're basically host assisted, I think. So I guess that would be slightly different from what you're saying here.
I've never liked the term host assisted. I don't know what's better, but I figured I'd whine while we're sitting here.
One thing we may need to keep in mind for describing the features that are provided by Cinder, generic way, or whatever, some of them, I'm trying to remember where this came up. I think it was maybe an online extend. Some of them aren't really driver dependent, but they end up being protocol dependent. And so they'll just work if you're using iSCSI and Fiber, but if you're using NFS or some other more obscure transport that's driver specific, you can run into limitations around that. And you have to be careful with how we state, all drivers should support X, because sometimes it's a limitation on libvirt or somewhere in Nova related to the protocol and not actually the driver. But that's the kind of thing that somebody making a new driver needs to be aware that they have to look at if they're not using iSCSI or Fiber.
Ryan, there seems to be a good number of drivers that support the storage assisted create volume from image. I have added at the end of the document a list on the drivers that probably support it. I mean, they have the method. I'm just not 100% sure if they actually do it. Looks like some of them don't.
Okay.
That they just, some of them may not be doing it right. Well, not right. It may not be doing it more efficient than the normal way, but that is for them to say.
Okay, so it looks like it's worth calling out as a separate category.
Looking at the code implemented in the drivers, probably not. Because from what I'm seeing, most drivers just attach the volume and copy the data.
Oh,
They don't seem to be doing anything fancy except RBD.
so I guess if we'd like to encourage drivers to do something fancy there, that would be one reason to add this to the support matrix.
Yeah, but I'm not sure if they can do something fancy, because the reason why RBD can do it is because Glance supports RBD as a native backend, which all the other drivers don't.
Right.
So probably we should not add this.
Okay.
So Gorka, I think the same is true for create image from volume as well, because I'm not sure like if any driver is doing that differently from each other. Like I have one topic of optimizing this flow for RBT to RBD later during PTG,
Yeah,
but
that's the one I was talking about. The create volume from image is the one that I just crossed because of that.
no, I'm talking about the next one, the create image from volume. When we are uploading a volume to image,
Oh, but that one doesn't say host assisted. That one already exists, and I don't know, we can remove it because it's not something that the drivers actually have to do.
yeah, that was my point. Like it's the same as creating a volume from image. Like
Yeah, maybe we should remove it. I don't know. Because do we have another location where we list the features supported by Cinder itself?
I don't know of anything off the top of my head. I think they just sort of show up in various places in the documentation.
So what was the question?
Do we have a single location where we list the features supported by Cinder, not specific drivers, but what we have implemented in general?
No, because I think we were worried about the vendor support part, and we never kind of split it up into, okay, here's what you get implicitly.
Well, I was not talking about implicitly, but the features that you may have in Cinder. For example, now we are discussing that the create image from volume is not driver specific. So maybe we should just remove it. But then the question comes to what does Cinder actually support? Like, do we have a list of everything, even if it's dependent on the driver? And it's not supported by everything. What are the features in Cinder.
You're wondering about end user documentation, right?
Yeah, something that doesn't have some user go and look into the specs, the support things supported by the Cinder client, the REST API, just a list.
Yeah, I mean, I would hope that we would have some documentation somewhere around, these are all the things you can do with a volume. But I don't know if we really have something organized very well for that or not. Because it might be in some OpenStack documentation outside of Cinder itself, which likely means it's going to be missing some pieces.
I actually think that may be a gap here.
I think the closest thing I can find to a list is just the pages that go off from that list of links. Sort of gives you a list of what Cinder can do, but it's not. Could use some work.
Yeah.
I think probably we need to add something to the front end users in the landing page.
I just put that link to the glance docs because I did this. So that's why I think it's great. But I've got this little matrix on the basic landing page that sort of breaks down by like user profile what part of the documentation would be good for you. So I'm wondering if we should do something like that.
Yeah, that's much nicer looking than what we currently have on the Cinder page.
Well, but it's nicer and easier, but in the end, we actually have something similar. We have a for end users section, for operators, for contributors, for reviewers. It is harder to see because.
Yeah, I think we have all the stuff. It's just it would be good if we put it here. It's easier to find.
I think our main problem in the Cinder is that there is not a big difference between the titles and subtitles. So for end users and tools for using Cinder, yeah, sure, the size is different, but there is not something that strikes to your eye like underscore, bold, something that makes one clearly stand out.
Right. I think that's where having the table of different roles is kind of nice, like Brian was showing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So we can reformat this one.
Yeah, it would just
Show me the roles again, just so I get that.
In our Cinder one or in the Glance one?
the link is line
Cinder.
28 in the
Oh, got it. Okay.
Etherpad that's being displayed here. Sorry.
So Gorka, on line 11, why it is extend detached volume? Like if we are
Because
talking,
we have an attach. If you look at the features that are driver dependent and are optional, there is an extend attach volume that is driver dependent. So
but if we create a,
sorry, yep.
I was saying if we create a new volume, then it's not detached, but like extend available volume, something like that.
Well, it is. The thing is that from, if I remember correctly, from Cinder's perspective, the code path detaches the volume before calling the extend. So when you create a volume or you clone a volume and you want the destination volume to be larger than the source of the cloning, it is the driver's responsibility how they do it. Basically, it's to create a volume, copy the data, detach it, and then extend it. Because we know for sure that that has to be supported by all the drivers. But the in-use, that's why it is extend detach volume. I didn't want to use in-use because apparently we don't use that the Cinder States in this document. If you look at the other references to attach, they don't say in-use, they just say attach. So
But
I don't know.
So you mentioned a case where we are like creating a new volume from a source volume and extending it. But if I'm just creating a volume and I'm extending it, then
every driver has to support it, but it's detached. That volume is detached, right?
We can't say that for sure because the detached word is mostly associated with the attached status. Like I'm not sure like how like it is quite confusing to me, but I'm not sure.
Let's say you just said I create a volume, I'm Gorka, I create a volume, that volume becomes available and then I extend it. The volume is detached.
The attached status says detached or is it none?
It doesn't matter what the status says. This is at a higher level. This is conceptually for a driver. The volume is not being used by anybody. Regardless of what Cinder says on the status, the volume exists and nobody's using it. That is what we say detach in contraposition to the attach. So
Yeah,
it is not mapped. It is not mapped, export, or used.
Okay, yeah, I'm more. I think I've seen
This
more.
is for you. This support matrix is not for us developers. In Cinder, checking the status of the volume is for, I think Brian mentioned before, kind of for operators, for people who want to select their storage vendor. So they know, looking at this, that an offline volume can be extended by any Cinder driver. That operation is available. And then if they want to use to see if it supports when the volume is attached, they have to look at the other option. I don't know which one. To option number 2, extend on attached volume. So this is not about Cinder internal code. That is irrelevant here. When we name things, I mean. I don't know if people prefer to say offline instead of detached.
I was thinking more of available, like extend and available volume, but maybe the reasoning is more correct.
But available comes to a Cinder status, because a volume that is attached from the perspective of, is the volume available? Yeah, it's alive, it's there. I think if I didn't know anything about Cinder and somebody told me, is the volume available? and I see that it is being used, I say, yes, it's available, it's working, it is there. But I don't mind saying available. I just saw that we were talking about attach in the other in the number 2 extend and attach volume, and I say, well, if they say attach instead of in use or anything like that, then I will use the attach in the other one.
Well, that's what we've normally done, is not used the actual states, but just the concept descriptors.
Yeah, and I think it makes sense in the context of the other things that are listed there too. But it's probably less ambiguous, like Gorka was saying, I think, to just say attached, detached. And we're just sort of using the colloquial meanings, not...
The problem too is if you try to say available, you'll end up with puzzles where you might have a volume that's in like maintenance state that you can do something to, which is similar to available but not available, and that's why it kind of helps to stick to just saying it's not attached or whatever.
Yeah, it makes sense.
So can we address Jay's dislike of host-assisted by just saying Cinder-assisted for like lines 18 and 20? Or is that not any better?
I mean, that's clearer to me. I don't know if it makes sense to other people.
It's not obvious to me what we would want to call it instead.
They are saying to call it Cinder assisted instead of host assisted. I think it is not perfect, but it clarifies it a little bit more on who is responsible for the movement of data. Even if the Cinder code doesn't do it and it calls a process to do the DD.
Because when I hear host assisted, I think like compute host, which, you know, maybe that's just me, but
I'm okay changing it to Cinder because saying Cinder assisted, backend assistant makes kind of clear the difference on the two parts.
Oh. Okay.
Yeah, I was thinking what Gorka had said was we're talking about back-end assisted, and then the contrast would be Cinder assisted, but right, instead of okay, there you go.
Sorry, not enough sleep.
So with the front end QoS, I'm trying to remember, you sort of configure that Cinder side, but we don't do anything actually.
Yep. And we decided to not. That's why I
Okay, so we just won't.
stroke. Yeah,
Okay.
I removed it. And maybe we can add that to the other list that I was saying of things that are supported by Cinder. QoS, front end or back end, that would be the feature in itself. But from the driver perspective, the
Okay.
front end relevant.
So,
And then we can move the other one that Rajat mentioned, the create image from volume,
okay.
to that other list.
So your sorry. So your idea is we should have another list, not on this page, but somewhere explaining, what functionality you just get out of the box with Cinder. Okay.
Well, not out of the box. If you have the proper driver, the proper configuration, and everything, and all the stars align, this is what you can get in Cinder.
Right. Yeah. Nothing comes out of the box. Okay. Okay.
We can probably add it to the landing page where it says what is Cinder, and below that, features available or something like that. Because I think if somebody goes to a landing page, it is great to see highly available, fault tolerant, recoverable. Yeah, everything sounds great, but features, what do you actually have besides the nice wording?
Okay. All right. So on this page, we'll keep the required driver functions, just so everybody's clear on what they have to do, either implement or would expect to get from any driver. And then, okay, so basically this page stays pretty much the way it was in terms of the functionality. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I think once we have the general list, we can remove some of the items from here, like the one Rajat mentioned, create image from volume. But until we have it, I would not modify it.
Okay, so let me give it to do here. Where am I looking? So I'll take that one. All right, then as far as, so we've got a few clarifications we can make on the names and a couple of the descriptions. But that looks like the page is basically okay, except for Chuck's suggestion of rotating the rows and columns. I'll have to take
I'm
a quick
working
look.
on that. I'll share a link here in a few minutes to show another way.
Oh, okay.
All right.
Yeah, because I think that's we have some code that uses the INI file to generate the links or something. I'm not sure. Okay. Sounds good. All right. Any other
Here's a Here's a visual. You can go look at that.
I'm on the wrong.
Definitely looks a lot better.
That doesn't suck.
Oh. Yeah, I agree. I think it's much easier to scroll down than to scroll left to right.
I think the only downside is if we cannot make the first line sticky, the one defining. Once you go down, you don't know which column belongs to what.
Yeah, there is a way to do that. I mean, in HTML. I'll have to figure out if we can do it through Sphinx. I'll talk to, Steve Finucane is going to be talking to us on Thursday about the database migration stuff, but he's done a lot of work on the OpenStack Sphinx extension. So we may be able to, he may have some ideas that can help us. Okay. All right, anything else on this? Okay, actually, since I got a couple of minutes, we got a question for you, Rajat, because this will impact you. So Stephen he's scheduled to do the SQL Alchemy to Alembic migration discussion first session on Thursday, but he's got to move it to 1400, which is when I've got your optimized creating a bootable volume session. So I'm assuming you'd be willing to move. So I just assumed that part. But would you want to do it at 1300 or 1330? Do you have a preference?
Both are fine. At 1300 sound good.
Okay, good. That's okay. Great. Thanks. I'll update the schedule. All right. Thank you. Okay. And then, so hopefully somebody from the Interop working group is going to join us if they haven't already. And I forgot to send a reminder, but I'm assuming they were aware. So let's see if somebody shows up in a minute or two. All right, well, I think this was kind of productive, getting that done. So
Interesting, at least.
yeah, I look forward to the volume driver API stuff tomorrow.
I think it was useful because a lot of the time we tend to leave things forgotten there.
Yeah.
And they get out of shape and yeah.
Okay. All right, so is anyone here from the Interop working group? I'm not sure who was going to come. But I think yeah, I'm not sure there's much we can do without somebody present. me see if I can find. Well, we may have to just skip on to the next topic and come back to this. I don't think there's anything urgent. In fact, there's not. So we'll just we may just postpone this to the first mid-cycle and get somebody then. Okay. All right. Well, somebody shows up, we'll adjust. But other than that, I think let's just move on to the next topic. And I'll update the PTG bot. Okay. So this section is about the community goals and the secure RBAC stuff. I went to the TC yesterday, but I don't believe the second community goal was actually discussed. Jay, maybe you know something. Rico Lynn had circulated an Etherpad a couple of months ago, trying to see if doing TLS everywhere would be, well, he was going to propose TLS everywhere as a community goal, but wanted to see, like, was everybody ready to do that? And in fact, we're not, because one of our CI jobs relies on TLS being off in order to work.
Okay.
And it's the CI job that's used for, I think it tests the backup. It tests the S3 backup driver because it uses a Swift proxy and not S3. And there's some kind of weird, well, I'm saying weird because I don't know what it is because I haven't looked at it. But for some reason, we can't get the TLS with the TLS proxies on, our S3 connection to Swift behaves abnormally and the job doesn't work. So I'd left that on the, but I don't know that we actually need TLS on to actually test what we're testing there with the S3 driver, which is that the driver works to do the backups. But I don't think that goal's been adopted, Jay, as far as you know.
No, I don't think it has. I think the last I remember discussing was that the RBAC effort was considered to still be rather sizable.
Okay.
And just because it's community goals doesn't mean that we need to have more than one every single time.
Oh, good.
So I think there were a couple of people who are like, well, what else could we do? But it hasn't really gotten traction, given that we have fewer development resource right now, and there's nothing super pressing.
Okay. Oh, good. All right. So okay.
And it's good to hear that you're kind of thinking down the same line as well.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Great. Then let's talk about secure RBAC. So, Alan, did you want to lead this, or do you want me to? I can kick things off.
Well, my first reaction was to say no. Let's go with that.
Okay. All right. So here's our situation. In the last cycle, we did some initial work. So if you haven't heard about this, there's an OpenStack. Well, how far back do we go? So like in Queens, Keystone implemented some stuff to make it easy. So let me go back even farther. So since the beginnings of time, people have been dissatisfied with what you get out of the box in terms of roles and how easy it is to set things up so that users have specific permissions to do specific things. Back in Queens, Keystone implemented some changes that by default introduced some roles and made them available as part of the Keystone bootstrap process. So specific roles and then inheritance of roles just are there. But they're there, but they don't actually do anything unless each of the individual services recognizes them and then acts appropriately based on what the semantics of the particular Keystone role is supposed to be. So that's this idea of secure and consistent RBAC. And the idea is it will be, if it's consistent across services, then it will be more secure because you won't have to configure it yourself. And if you've ever configured any of these policy files to try to get them to behave in a custom manner, you know that it's not easy to do, and it's not easy to get right. So it's easy to make changes. It's not easy to make correct changes, and it's really easy to make changes that are bad. So anyway, so we're trying to alleviate that. So we started working on that in Cinder in the last cycle, and it turned out, we thought it would be a fairly significant thing, and it turned out to be even more significant. So you may remember there was a spec. I've put up a patch that's listed here in the Etherpad on line 183 that splits that spec up, because it turned out we were only able to do part of it in Xena, and we'll do the other part in Yoga. So part of the problem with this is you have to divide up the parts so that things make sense, or else, because if you're left with a half implementation, it doesn't do anything. So what we did in Xena was we basically used only roles to distinguish between different types of entity interacting with the Cinder API. And what we're going to do in Yoga is we're going to take advantage of another dimension that Keystone added to users. So in addition to having roles, you can also have a scope to which your roles apply. And so we're going to work on recognizing the scope. So that's explained in the spec. So please feel free to review and approve that spec as soon as you can. And also there's a document that I think that's listed on line 185 in Etherpad that explains the whole thing. So it gives you the idea of so the way the community is describing this effort is that you have a list of personas that describe sort of idealized users and how they would interact with OpenStack. And then we are implementing the personas by using keystone roles and in Yoga keystone scopes. So hopefully I wrote that out much more clearly than I am speaking it out loud. So please go there and take a quick look. And there's also an implementation schedule that explains what part we did in Xena. And as far as I can tell, that I'm not going to tempt fate by saying it's working, but we haven't heard any major complaints yet. And then, although of course Xena's only been out for a week. And then what we're going to be doing in Yoga. So I think it's explained fairly clearly there. And then as far as the implementation details of how we're doing this, Alan's going to talk about that a little bit. There's a big comment in the policies/base.py that explains exactly how we're doing it in terms of Cinder code. So basically, if you're an operator or someone who just wants to have a general knowledge of what we're doing, that HTML page is good. That's on line 186. If you want to see in more detail exactly how we're doing this and making the changes, more or less, then you can look in this big comment in the code in the base policy file. And that's it. That's basically what's going on. And I should just single out, Alan took on a major role and wrote the test harness that we used to do the testing. And Sophia and Rajat did a lot of heavy lifting in doing this. And then other cores also did a lot of reviews to make sure all this made sense. So anyway, that's what we're doing. So this time it's a community goal. So the hope is that everybody will have this finished by Yoga. And then OpenStack itself will have consistent and secure RBAC. Except for the changes they're going to have to make to, but I won't talk about that.
And the crowd goes wild.
Yes, I guess at this point, should I give people time to look at that stuff, or should we just move on, or how do we want to handle this? Or I could take questions, or we could let Alan talk.
I don't have a whole lot to say. So the work in Xena was to support all of these project-based personas. And remember, as a little bit of a Cinder outsider, I've been kind of dabbling with Cinder, but most of my responsibilities are outside of Cinder. The thing that always tripped me up for a while was the fact that in Cinder, a project administrator is not the admin that we traditionally think of it as. What we traditionally think of as an admin, I think, is primarily going to be the system scoped administrator, not a project specific administrator. As far as what's up ahead in Yoga, what we're basically trying to do is deprecate the traditional admin API concept that we have and migrate to Keystone's system-scoped admin role. And one of the trickiest aspects, just in my own mind, about all of this is the fact that the Cinder endpoint always has a project ID in it. And if you are a system-scoped administrator, you don't belong to a specific project. And so there's some thinking going on, Ryan and I and others as well, of course, but we've been meeting quite regularly with Lance Bragstead to kind of come up with how we're going to approach dealing with project IDs in URLs and what that might mean for a system-scoped administrator that is not a member of a project. So anyways, that's, from my own perspective, really what's immediately ahead of us for development in Yoga. And as we kind of come up with a plan of attack, that will all be shared, of course, in specs and reviews, et cetera.
Yeah, so the old way of thinking of this stuff was that, well, right, part of RBAC is the role based. So in order to for a user to have a role, you had to have a role on a project. So that's where all this project talk is coming from. And then in Queens, Keystone introduced this idea of scope so that you could have a user who had system scope, and then that user can interact with a system independently of any roles they might have. And then they can have roles also, so you can distinguish between different levels of system scope. But that's basically what's going on. So what we did in Xena was we basically made changes so that our APIs recognize the reader role and treat it as like a read-only, as giving someone permissions to do only, I don't even know how to say this, to give somebody only read-only permissions on the API, basically. But since we don't recognize scope yet, if you have the admin role, that's the only way we've got to recognize someone who's authorized to be an administrator, meaning someone who can, like, do all the kind of admin stuff you'd expect in Cinder. So I don't know what I'm trying to say. So basically, you have a system administrator, but the way they're actually implemented is as having the admin role on some project. So that's what we'll be removing in Yoga, so that the system administrator is someone who has a system scoped token. I'm not sure if that's the right way to say it. And then that will give us the freedom to have project level administrators who can be considered an administrator, but only of a particular project within Cinder. So the main example of that is when Rajat implemented the default, I don't remember what we called it. It's not the default volume type. It was the project specific volume types. We wanted to say, okay, somebody in your project should be able to do that, but not everybody in your project, because that makes it kind of pointless, I guess, if everybody can change the default. So that's a role where it might make sense for somebody to be distinguished as the project administrator, and they can administer stuff within the project. The only thing being the project default volume type at this point. But there are other possibilities, and other services may do things. But other services may have wider ranges of stuff that a project admin can do. I'm starting to think that was not a clarifying statement at all. So I think I'm just going to shut up. So what you
Well,
can do,
to come
though,
at it from a different direction, within Cinder, so much of our focus is on, the back ends and their capabilities, et cetera. But because that spans projects, if you're trying to limit the scope of someone's admin access to a project, then they can't touch any of the stuff associated with the back end. So that's why project administrators really can't do a heck of a lot in Cinder. We need the system scoped administrator to handle anything like that.
So the current plan is to, regarding the URL, the project ID and the URL, the current plan is to supply a fake UUID or something like that from the Cinder client side, and don't change any endpoint, right?
That's what I think we're still solidifying.
yeah, I'm not quite sure. So the two options are what you just said, keep it there, but we could do a fake one or something for administrators. The other thing is the way Nova did this was they introduced a micro version that made the project ID optional in the URL. And I'm trying to remember why that seemed like a really good idea. But anyway, that's what they did. So after 2.18, you don't need a project ID in the URL anymore. If it's in there, it doesn't break anything. But basically, Nova just works on what project ID comes back in the context from after the middleware is processed, what comes back from Keystone. So yeah.
Okay.
I have to write out some stuff to try to get this better in my head. So I like the project ID in the URL in terms of a way of organizing resources. But yeah, so those are the two things. So the other thing that's slightly problematic is the way the service catalog gets generated. If you, in order to get the project ID into the URL that comes back in the service catalog, you have to have a project ID template in there. And then the way that works is if the user does not have a project, then there's no, right, the template returns empty string. So you don't get any endpoints. And then that means that an administrator who's trying to use one of the clients in order to, interact with the systems, where the client makes the request, comes back, gets the, the service catalog, and then picks the Cinder endpoint out of there isn't anything. And then the administrator can't do anything. So we're trying to figure out exactly how to get around that. Oh, here's Lance.
Hey, sorry, I joined a little bit late.
No, that's okay. We're trying to whip up excitement to, we want to get everybody into a frenzy of RBAC implementation. And you can see I'm doing a real bang up job at that.
It's a tough thing to get excited about, trust me.
Yeah, so at this point, I should just shut up and let other people talk.
The one thing I just wanted to mention, I was going through the spec and I don't see, I'm not sure if there are, but we have database validations based on project IDs, and I don't see anything related to that. Maybe there is no bug related to that, but somehow I thought we might face problems there.
Yeah, we sort of acknowledged that, yep, that may be a problem. one of the challenges is that we've got validation code that's sort of doing authorization in various places. The database checks, there's some additional checks at the WSGI layer, and all of that's going to have to be kind of flushed out and cleaned up as needed.
Yeah, my thought about the database checks is I think we may be okay because the database is checking, it uses the context to make sure that that the project ID is correct. So as long as that's populated correctly,
right,
we should be okay there. And then for the ones where it's using the isAdmin check, we can just change that when the Cinder context is created. And what we'll do is check for system scope in order to set isAdmin. And then the code farther down the layer should still be able to function the way it does now. We might get some weirdness in that you might not be able to configure something in the policy file that you might expect to be able to configure. But I'm thinking that would be a bug to be reported rather than, so basically what we want to have happen is we want to have the 5 personas that we're going to support function correctly out of the box. And we also don't want to make it the case that you can configure stuff on your own that wildly breaks things. So what I think might happen is there might be a case where you're trying to configure something in policy that isn't allowed because of one of the database checks. But since the database checks are conservative, I believe what will happen is that you won't be able to open up something to a wider audience than should be able to see it, and then we'll have to correct that later. So that's my theory. But I think that's correct. So I think we probably shouldn't be doing database layer checks, but I think we can continue to do them without, well, what am I trying to say? We'll be able to implement the personas without making those changes. And what's nice about doing the personas is we're adding all these extra tests. So once we have all those tests in place, then we can start monkeying around with the database layer, and then we'll be protected because we'll have much more thorough testing than we've got now. So that's, maybe I should have said that like explicitly instead of said nothing in the spec.
One thing about that, like Glance pretty much went through the same exercise, and Dan can probably speak to that a lot better than I can, since he was the one that actually worked on it. But if we keep around the layer in the database that does this kind of somewhat like, I'm going to check at least this specific case for authorization, and then we try and retrofit that to work with system scope, we will be adding more complexity. Like, we're going to be implementing the personas not only in the policy checks, but we're also going to be implementing it in another layer within Cinder too. So that could be like just something to think about from a tech debt perspective. And it's one of the main reasons that Glance decided to try and refactor all of the authorization stuff up into a single layer before adding more support for the additional personas.
I don't know what you just said, Lance, but they didn't like that. So is the thought that Cinder is going to implement personas at the database layer? No?
No, it's that
we have legacy checks at the database layer that have been in the system for so long that there's a general fear that, oh, let's just take them out. We may end up opening up a hole inadvertently that we're otherwise not aware of.
But that's, so everybody has that, right?
Right.
So
the thought was that we can maybe retain the database checks as long as we can make them kind of compatible with the yoga goals for secure RBAC. And then once we've got secure RBAC in place, we can experiment with taking the database checks out later and see if anything breaks before taking them out.
Yeah. The fear definitely resonates with me. We did leave, I mean, actually we didn't really remove checks from the database, but we had checks in other layers. And what we did was, this is not normally good, not normally something I would say as a strength of the Glance code base, but Glance has lots of layers. And so what we did was in the policy layer that was actually implementing most of the stringent checks, we started passing down a don't load that layer per call. So we were able to not to say, if we did it in the database has no idea what's going on. So, you remove a database check and it removes it for everything. And we started not applying policy layer checks at the old layer per call. So for get instances, we would implement the new scheme and stop implementing the old policy check at that layer just for get images. But our database checks were so naive that was doable, and that might not be the case for Cinder. But I mean, regardless, the fear is always going to be there. So even if you implement it all in the API properly, the fear is going to come right back when you hopefully circle back to cleaning that mess up. So
yeah, I'm thinking if we circle back, we'll have all these new tests in place that'll give us more confidence that we're not.
The problem is the tests are actually not. You've got to make sure that the tests are actually hitting the new checks and not the old checks, which is difficult, and is actually why we started peeling them back call by call, because it was really difficult. We were having database code that would trigger 404s, right, for resources that existed, and it was super difficult to tell why we got that 404, So we started out with that approach where we're just, certainly we'll just add a layer of rejection in front, and then we will know that everything's getting rejected, and then we can remove the old things. But then we realized that, oh no, we're actually making it all the way down to the database, and it did a check, and we're getting a 404 from there. So it's nice idea, but for us it was difficult to actually make that happen.
Okay, well, I think please take a look at the specs. You'll be hearing a lot more about secure RBAC throughout the entire cycle. So there will be plenty of opportunities to participate in reviews and coding and stuff. Any general observations or questions? I see Arcadi's here, so we can pick up with the interoperability working group issues. All right. Well, like I've been saying, if you any second thoughts or comments or questions, put them in the Etherpad and we'll check them out tomorrow. otherwise, that was an update to let you know what's going on with that effort.
So just to, because I joined a little late, the idea is to work through the spec to kind of figure out how Cinder is going to adopt system scope.
Well, yeah, I guess that's right.
I'm curious about that too, because we've been having, this is like the third conversation of the morning where I think about system scope. Did you guys already talk about that? Like what things are going to be system scoped and not?
No, but I thought we'd already decided that, right? In terms of, how do you mean, Dan?
Well, I think we kind of did, Brian, when Alan mentioned the difference between other projects and Cinder, because basically
right. Okay.
all our, except one, everything that an admin can do is basically system scoped in Cinder. Except one operation, which is set in the per project default volume type.
So I think that Neutron thought a lot of the same sort of things, and several things in Nova ended up the same way. And so I'm curious if that's really true for Cinder, or if Cinder is going through the same kind of assumption that the other projects are. So what's an example of an admin system scope only operation? Just pick one. No, I'm asking you.
Creating volume types.
Creating volume types. Okay, so volume types are not tied to any project. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay, cool.
Well, they can be, because they can be private, right?
Oh.
But that doesn't matter, because Dan, that doesn't matter, because the reality is that a system administrator has to do it, because it has to know the backend knowledge, and that is system administrator knowledge, which is the problem we have in Cinder. Everything,
Okay, so seeing volume types,
not seeing, creating them.
Yeah. Seeing
Actually,
volume types is project scoped, but
we have a big matrix that we made of the personas we're going to support and all the API operations you can do. So I think we've been through and already thought about it for everything, or at least that's my line. I'm going to stick to it. So if you want to take a look at the policy matrix, you can.
Yeah, it's line 186 of our Etherpad, Dan.
Okay.
Thanks.
I'm not saying that you guys are not the only ones that figured this out properly, but so far, Glance, Neutron, and Nova have all gotten it wrong. And we like did a bunch of work, and Nova has already implemented a lot of this stuff, and now we are realizing that we need to undo it. So I just,
well,
that's
then
all.
Please take a quick look at this, because my feeling is that we thought it through and we're good. So
we're good until we aren't.
Soon if we're not, yes.
Yeah. Well,
conversely, it might be good to know what did Nova and Glance run into.
Well, Glance is the least interesting case. So where is the link to the matrix? Sorry.
If you have our Etherpad up, it's on line 186.
In the Nova and Neutron case, it's things like port binding when we're getting ready to attach an instance to the network. We've got a port and we're going to bind that thing, and that's a admin only operation. It's something that only Nova should do, and so that got converted to if scopes are enabled, that's a system scope thing, and Nova needs a system scoped token to do it. but that's not really what system scope is for, and it's a project scoped resource, right? So the port is project scoped, and really we're saying that Nova needs to have a role of I'm a machine that should be able to network things to do that on a port, but it still should be scoped to a project so that Nova or Neutron's regular tenant enforcement is in play and doesn't accidentally let you, even though you have that role, apply that to a port that's not within the scope of the conversation right now. And so I just would expect that, given that, volumes are kind of similar to ports and other things that, Nova consumes, that maybe some of those things leaked out as well.
But I think in the Cinder case, we actually allow almost most of those kind of operations that Nova makes for the users as well. So
Project members.
Myself as a user, I can do the attach. I can request Cinder to delete an attachment, create it, do everything, because I think there are only maybe a couple of cases where we actually have Nova using a special token.
Sure.
The rest is normal user calls, if I remember correctly.
Right. So like, for example, I just scroll down to the snapshots thing, and you say that system reader should be able to list all snapshots, but snapshots are project scoped resources, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that what we're all realizing is that implying that system reader can read project scoped resources with reckless abandon is not actually what we want for system scope. That's a domain level thing, or a project level thing, or some sort of scope to resources that have projects, but they're scoped to projects, so you need to be in that hierarchy. Whereas sounds like volume types is actually system scoped in that there is no project scope for it. So and like Nova's example is aggregates or hypervisors. Those are things that don't have any project affiliation whatsoever. They are purely elements of the system, and there's no other. The reason that we have to leak project admin to everything right now is because otherwise there would be no way to manage those things, because they don't have project affiliation. And that's what system scope is supposed to be for, is the things that otherwise don't have any project affiliation, but for something, I'm guessing, like a snapshot or a port or an instance, you wanting to be able to manage all of those things as a root user kind of a thing is rather a role assignment on a sufficiently high element in that hierarchy that allows you to see all of those things.
I think maybe we in the project Cinder misunderstood what the things meant, but as far as we understood, the system, the admin role meant in terms of privileges, whereas something like project scope, system scope, everything it did is spawn across the different projects that we had. So if you're a project admin or whatever, you can just play with one project. If it's system, you spawn across the different projects. So one is,
that's the problem, is that that's the assumption that everybody made. And so now in Nova and Neutron, we have this problem where, and you guys also, because you have project IDs and URLs, there's a little bit of a way around this, but the classic example was I, as a system admin, should have somehow this ability to create resources on behalf of a user, or to like reboot the server for a user, right? But the problem is, like, servers are project scoped, and so are the audit log for actions that we've taken on a server, right? So if someone shows up with a non-project scoped token to do a restart on a server on behalf of somebody else, we literally cannot create that audit log record because we don't have a project ID to record there, right? So that we can actually audit who did that thing. And that led to this conversation. It's like, oh, well, maybe system scoped tokens should have this like extra project override that you pass in, so that if we need to do anything on project resources, we'll say it was this project, and then we end up having to pass that all the way through to Neutron and then to designate, and that came to the realization that, like, we're really breaking the thing here. What you want is, if you need to be able to create resources on, project scoped resources on behalf of a user, or manage, reboot something for someone, you should have a role assignment that allows you to do that thing on a sufficiently high thing in the project hierarchy, which might be the domain or might be the root of all domains. And therefore you've got a project ID or a domain ID that basically gives you your identity for project scoped resources. And that's how that should happen, to eliminate these kinds of issues. And that system scoped tokens should be for things that don't have project affiliation, which it sounds like volume types would be your example.
Yeah, so part of the reason why I think maybe I got wires crossed here was that I was under the assumption that like system users should be able to continue doing what they're doing with that role moving forward. And like as Dan said, I don't think that's the case anymore. So that's probably part of the reason why things were confused.
I think the problem comes from the fact that right now we have project admins that are able to do everything, but only because we have no other way of allowing people to do everything. And so then we have this like, okay, well, project admins are currently global admins. Well, global is system. Well, obviously that's system scope users. So we'll make project admins, and system must be the thing that can do everything across projects. But that really breaks everything, right? What we really need is to say that you're admin, but on a sufficiently high element of the hierarchy, not that you're this other thing that doesn't have a project.
But what does it mean in high enough level of the hierarchy? What hierarchy are we talking about?
Well, Lance should talk, but I think it's root, domain, maybe more domains, projects.
Yeah, so in Keystone, regardless of how you configure it, every project belongs to a domain. And so there's a hierarchy there, and then you can have multiple domains, and your domains are kind of like the root of the project tree, right? So you can have like domain foo, and then under that you have a whole bunch of projects, and then they can have projects underneath them. So you have a tree of projects that ultimately bubble up to a domain, and a domain is always a root of a project tree. You can never have a domain underneath another domain. So
okay, but there's some implicit root of all the domains, right?
Yes. So like I think what Dan's saying here is like if you have like a server that you want to reboot in like one of the leaf nodes, like you should make sure you have a role assignment on just that area, and then be able to go reboot that server, or take a snapshot or whatever, as opposed to like here's my big huge hammer as a system admin and go do the thing in that project.
Yeah, and in theory, like Dan says, if you want to have that big hammer, just go and assign it to the root instead of the domain of the project. You go to the root of everything, and then you have access as well, right? If you assign the privileges. Yep.
I think there's also some stuff, and again, I should not be talking, but I'm going to anyway because that's what I do. I think that what Lance was saying is that in the previous session is that at the moment that root is not necessarily exposed either at all or as much as it would be because this is not currently a thing, but that's probably what we need to do so that you have that ability to just say this is a root user. I mean, for a relatively smallish organization, they're probably only going to have one domain anyway, right? And so that's the thing. And if they don't need super separated, I don't know, Lance, do people use domains for like geos as well? Or I guess that wouldn't really make sense, but
geos like regions?
Yeah.
Not that I've seen. Like the
so
most
it really
typical use.
Should be an organization, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of how we designed it within Keystone, is like where you have a domain. And for example, if you wanted your domain to back to a specific identity provider, right? Want users to come from LDAP, like you can map them into this specific domain.
So the reasons that you would have multiple domains in a single domain or deployment or whatever, I guess, would be if you've got literally people like from one whole wing of the organization that are in LDAP and another one that are like, I don't know, Windows users, and your Active Directory is your backing for them or something, right? But anybody else that's any more organized would all probably be under one domain.
Right. Yep. Or if for some reason you have a requirement to logically group certain projects and users for some requirement or whatever, then you could isolate them to their own domain. But
so that literally users from one domain don't exist in the other, right?
Correct. Yep. If you wanted to namespace your users and projects, like you want two projects named dev, but they have to live in different domains. But that, you know.
Clarification. So we're talking about the hierarchical administrative boundary, that Keystone concept. Is that right?
I believe so, yeah.
Well, I think that the Cinder project is hearing about this for the first time right now. So kind of not great.
You're not, does it help that you're not the only one? I mean, I have that to offer you. I think that the thing is that it's a very complicated thing where a lot of stuff has started to move, and there have been a lot of assumptions. Everybody has made assumptions. I mean, basically, if you want to blame somebody, we can all blame Lance, but Lance is like super lovable, and nobody wants to do that. So, you know, no, I'm just kidding. It's just a complex thing, and we're all kind of spread out, and we all have assumptions, and we're all figuring it out right now. So.
Yeah, I mean, last PTG, we thought we had this nailed down, and we thought for sure just, okay, I'm going to be able to pass my system scope token with this project ID, and that's going to do the thing that I need to do. Like we thought that was going to be the path forward. And now that we're revisiting it, it seems that that's not the case anymore.
Well,
because we've actually started to hammer on it.
That was based on assumptions, right? It was based on assumptions of what system scope should be. And then, you know, we make a little bit more progress implementing this thing. Like, this really feels like a hack, you know?
So it sounds to me like we're going to have to implement domain personas, and that these kind of actions that are supposed to take place in a project but done by somebody outside the project would be assigned to the domain persona and not to the system admin. I mean, not to the system dash personas.
I think, again, I will speak out of one of my orifices, and Lance can correct me, but I think that the way this works from like what Cinder needs to know is the user shows up and the token has roles on it, and a Keystone decides whether you got admin or not based on the project scoping of your token. So if you have a token for a Leaf project and you don't have admin on that, you won't have that admin role, and Keystone or Cinder can look at Cinder's policy rules can look at the admin role or not on your token to decide whether you can do a thing. And if you showed up with a domain scoped token, or that where you got the admin at the top level, you'll just still have admin role, and Cinder doesn't need to know how you got that role. That didn't make much sense.
That doesn't sound right.
Lance.
Right.
That sounds like if it's based on the role check, like if all you're checking is role, like role admin, then it doesn't matter what that role is on. You could have a system admin token, it'll work. You could have a domain admin token, it'll work. Project admin token, it'll all work. The other approach, like using the actual hierarchy within Keystone, would be to use the, like if you look at the Cinder Etherpad on line 194, is a link to like the OS inherit API in Keystone where you can say, like, I'm going to give Gorka the admin role on the domain, and as a result, he's going to inherit admin to all the various projects underneath it. So then when he needs to go create a snapshot for something in Project Foo, which is one of the Leaf projects, he's going to get a token scoped to that specific project itself, right?
And he will have admin because he has admin on the domain.
Right, but Cinder's not actually understanding the concept of a domain in that case. He's like, Cinder is still just consuming a project scoped token like it is today.
Right. That's what I was trying to say, but yours sounds way better.
So this work is done by Keystone automatically. We supply a domain scope token.
Yeah, Keystone implemented this, so I can't remember when. It's been around for a long time.
The inherited roles, you mean?
Yep. There would still
That's what I'm saying. You show up to
the.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
No.
Okay. We still need to think about how we do this from the client, right? Because the admin wants to be able to do something in a project, right? And it's what's that user experience? They need to know what project that is. They need to know, like, okay, I need to go create a snapshot of this volume. So I need to figure out like what project that is, or I need to be able to even look at that volume in the first place.
But from a Cinder point of view, you show up with a token and it has role on it, and Cinder does not need to know how you got that role, whether you are assigned that role explicitly in that project or Keystone gave you that because it inherited it from the fact that you have that on the domain.
With this new information, I think the APIs in Cinder get a more clear division between what the system code could do and what a normal admin for the project or the domain